Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend where power, betrayal, and divine punishment slowly began to turn like a hidden wheel in the dark. In ancient Thessaly, Ixion appeared to have everything a king could desire: authority, ambition, and the chance to bind himself to a noble house through marriage. Yet beneath the torchlight of royal halls, something cold and dangerous was already growing. A promise would be broken, trust would be twisted into treachery, and one choice, made in pride, would open a path that led far beyond the world of mortal kings. Before this night is over, you will follow Ixion from a wedding feast into exile, from exile into the halls of Olympus, and from divine mercy into a fate so strange that even the gods would turn it into a warning for all ages. This is a legend that moves quietly at first, but with every step it becomes darker, stranger, and more impossible to escape. As you listen, you will pass through mountain kingdoms, shadowed banquets, sacred halls, and the bright stillness of Olympus itself, where one man is given a mercy he does not deserve. But instead of being changed by grace, Ixion reaches for something forbidden, and that single act begins to pull the whole story toward its terrible end. Long before the wheel appears, you will feel it turning beneath the surface of every scene. And that is what makes this tale so haunting. It is not only about punishment, but about how a man can keep destroying the very gift that might have saved him. Before we begin this epic, I have a small request that means a lot to me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The greatest reward for all the effort I put into creating these epics is your support through subscribing to my channel. If you enjoy my content and want me to continue creating more, your subscription and like truly give me great motivation. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Your comments not only encourage me, but also help me understand what kind of epics and stories you would like to see on this channel. Thank you so much in advance for your support. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of this ancient legend guide you. Wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Ixion and the eternal wheel of fire, the king who betrayed the gods, begins now. Those who lived across the wide plains of ancient Thessaly knew that the land gave more than crops. It gave character. The wind that came down from the mountains of Magnesia cut across a person's face. The cold waters in the valleys sank into the bones, and the summer heat tested both body and patience. In such a place, people did not soften early. A word was not given easily, and once given, it was not broken easily. A guest was considered protected the moment he sat down to bread. The honor of a house showed itself when its door opened. The honor of a king showed itself when he kept his word. Ixion grew up in that land. When he was born as the son of Leonteus, he drew notice even in childhood. He was strong, quick, and extraordinary on horseback. His peers tired themselves trying to keep up with him, while he seemed to learn everything more directly, more harshly, and more quickly. The courage he showed in the hunt during his youth, the discipline he carried in training, and the fearless edge in his nature impressed the leading men of the Lapiths. People said they saw in him a man made for kingship, but the old men sensed something else beneath that brilliance. Ixion did not only love standing out, he believed standing in front was his natural right. When he took the throne, everyone saw it. From a distance, the palace of the Lapiths looked magnificent and reassuring. Thick stone walls, high gates, broad courtyards, and well-kept stables openly displayed a ruler's power. But everyone who stepped inside felt that those walls held not only order, but tension. The servants spoke with caution, the guards did not move before an order came, and the advisors weighed every word before using it. Ixion was a king who loved creating silence around himself. People approached him carefully not only out of respect, but because they could never fully predict what might anger him. Even so, no one could call him untalented. He established order in Thessaly quickly, secured the borders, and restored strength to the name of the Lapiths. The problem did not lie in his ability, but in his soul. When he gained a victory, he did not find it enough and immediately sought another form of superiority. When he saw devotion, he did not treat it like something entrusted to his protection, but like a force that already belonged in his hands. He had begun to see himself not merely as a king, but as a man with the right to shape the fate of everyone around him. That was why, in the first years of his reign, the thing that occupied his mind most was not war, but marriage. Ixion knew his rule would not be complete unless he formed ties with the powerful bloodlines of Thessaly. A sword could make a man feared, but a dynastic bond gave him permanence. That thought led him to Dioneus, one of the most respected names in the region. The old king was known for his gravity, his honesty, and his unshaken sense of measure. His words were few, his judgment was clear, and his anger came slowly. Everyone in Thessaly knew that the friendship of Dioneus was hard to gain and impossible to repair once lost. His daughter Dia had been raised in the same atmosphere of care within her father's house. People spoke of Dia's beauty, but what truly made her memorable was the thoughtfulness in her face. She did not answer at once. She listened first. She could easily sense the small shifts in people's voices and the distance between the words they spoke and the intention they hid. Courtly upbringing had not produced an artificial delicacy in her, but an inward attentiveness. That was why when she first stood before Ixion, she saw more than those around her did. When Ixion looked at her, there was nothing ordinary in that gaze. Desire lived in the young king's eyes, yes, but there was more possession than warmth inside it. Dia did not put that feeling into words at once. She only sensed that the man before her was looking at her not as a person, but as a meaning. She was the daughter of Dioneus. She was the most valuable bond in that house. In Ixion's eyes, that meant not only a beautiful wife, but also a powerful gate waiting to be opened. Dioneus watched the young king just as carefully. Ixion spoke with restraint. He was as humble as the moment required and as confident as the moment allowed. As he spoke of the future of the Lapiths, of the balance that could be built in Thessaly, and of the strength that would arise from the union of the two houses, not a flawed sentence passed his lips. He framed his marriage proposal not as a dry political calculation, but as a foundation of mutual respect and lasting peace. Dioneus saw how flawless the words were, but sometimes a man's eyes hold what his mouth conceals. There was exactly that kind of hardness in Ixion's gaze. Even so, the old king did not turn that instinct into immediate refusal. In Thessaly, the safest peace sometimes came through kinship between two houses. As the talks stretched on, movement began in both palaces. Messengers came and went. Fabrics, vessels, and ornaments for the ceremony began to gather. In the house of Dioneus, preparations for a great wedding were underway. There was a similar energy in the palace of the Lapiths. The wine cellars were opened, game animals were chosen, and musicians were summoned. Across Thessaly, people talked about the marriage and said the union of two powerful houses would bring stability for many years. With every meeting, Ixion succeeded in making himself seem a little more indispensable. Even in the middle of those preparations, Dia never felt complete peace. Ixion's words always fell into the right places, but something was missing in him. It was the softness that came unbidden when a person looked at someone he loved. The young king did not have it. He kept everything under control, left no moment empty, and carried even his most natural gesture as though it had been chosen beforehand. One night, Dia did not openly object to her father, but there was a question inside her silence. Dioneus noticed it. He valued his daughter's instinct. Even so, he did not step back from his decision. Sometimes danger did not appear openly. It was only felt. And what was felt often disappeared beneath the hope of a great order about to be built. When the wedding day came, Thessaly looked radiant. The sky was clear. The wind was not harsh. The light striking the stone walls made the palaces look even more magnificent. The guests took their places, prayers were spoken, and cups were raised. That day, Ixion stood like a flawless king. He was respectful toward Dioneus, attentive toward Dia, and measured before the crowd. His voice stayed calm as the vows were spoken. He appeared generous as he spoke of the gifts. He mentioned his finest horses, valuable cups, fertile lands, and other offerings worthy of a king's honor. He said all of it with such certainty that no one in the hall doubted his words. When Dia's hand was placed in his, those gathered in the hall believed a powerful union had been formed. When Dioneus looked at his daughter, he saw not fear, but caution. That made him pause for a moment, but the approving murmur of the crowd, the rising sound of the music, and the flawless flow of the ceremony covered that brief hesitation. Great disasters often took root at the very moment when everyone believed everything stood exactly where it should. After the days of feasting passed, the first weeks went by quietly. The palaces remained in place. The marriage had been formally established. From the outside, no problem could be seen, but as time moved on, a small silence began to grow in the house of Dioneus. None of the great promises made before the wedding had yet been fulfilled. At first, the delay was considered natural. After such unions, order settled gradually, and gifts were delivered in time. Dioneus did not rush, but as days turned into weeks, the delay no longer looked like simple forgetfulness. Each time, Ixion offered a different excuse. At times, he said the army required his attention. At times, he pointed to the counting of the treasury. At times, he said the proper moment would come soon. Everything he said could sound reasonable when heard on its own. But when all of it came together, a different picture emerged. As Dioneus continued to wait, he began to understand that the word had not merely been delayed, it had been loosened. And one evening, as Dia looked into her husband's face, this thought took full shape inside her for the first time. This man was not taking back what he had given. This man had simply begun to think less of the word he had given. That was when the true break began. There was still no quarrel. There was no open crime. There was only an invisible but deep shift. When a king began to treat his word lightly, disaster had already chosen its direction, even if it had not yet come into view. Dioneus was not a man who lost his patience easily. He had spent his youth in war and his maturity weighing men. That was why he did not raise his voice at the first delays. He knew that not every promise made by a king could be fulfilled the very next day. After great marriages, gifts sometimes arrived piece by piece, and sometimes people waited for order to settle into place. But here, the matter had stopped being a delay that time could explain. Each new explanation Ixion offered did not correct the one before it. It only pushed it a little farther ahead. And Dioneus now saw that this was not chance, but choice. One morning he sent his messengers back. He did not send an angry note. He did not deliver a harsh threat either. He asked that Ixion come before him in person. The message was short. The time had come to speak of the promises made before the wedding. When Ixion arrived, only a few people were in the hall. Dioneus had not wanted to humiliate him before a crowd. He was still leaving a door open. When the young king entered, he was dressed as neatly as ever. His gaze was self-assured, and his voice was calm. Someone seeing him for the first time might not have understood the tension between them, but the old king could now recognize the cold, inner contempt that lay behind the ease on his son-in-law's face. "I am not reminding you of what I gave you," Dioneus said. "I am reminding you of the promise you gave." His voice was not loud. In fact, the stone walls of the hall made his words heavy even without shouting. Dioneus spoke of the gold cups, the fertile lands, the fine horses, and the vows spoken before everyone on the wedding day. He said that these were not merely gifts, but part of the trust between two houses. He added that if a king's word grew light, everything that followed it would grow light as well. As Ixion listened, he seemed to incline his head slightly. But this was not respect. He had taken on the manner of a man listening carefully to someone criticizing him. When Dioneus finished speaking, a brief silence followed. Then Ixion spoke. "Everything will be done in its time." He did not say that sentence only once. First he spoke of the army, then of the treasury being put back in order. After that, he said that the proper time had not yet come, but would come soon. His voice was measured, his words were careful, but there was a clear intention beneath his sentences. He was not settling the matter, only continuing to delay it. In that very moment, Dioneus understood that the real problem was not lack or hardship. The problem was that Ixion no longer considered these promises binding. For the first time, the old king let some of the patience leave his face. "It will be done in its time," he said slowly. "But when, a year from now, 2 years from now, or never, as long as no one asks you?" A very slight smile appeared at the corner of Ixion's mouth. That small movement ended the last of Dioneus's doubts. The young king was not carrying the argument like a difficult but legitimate conversation between equals. He saw being called to account as a humiliation in itself. Dia was in the hall that day as well. As her father spoke, she watched the heaviness on his face, and as Ixion answered, she studied that slippery tone settling into his voice. Her husband's words were not openly insulting, but they held something more wounding than insult: disregard. Dia knew her father was right. The promises made on the wedding day had been clear and substantial. Their delay was not just a technical detail of a marriage, it was the first moment in which respect was being tested. And instead of stepping back from that test, Ixion made the matter seem like an overblown detail being made too much of. The conversation did not end in an open break. No doors were slammed and no threats were hurled, but everyone who left the hall felt that a line had been crossed, one that would be hard to cross back over. Even so, Dioneus wanted to give his final answer not with a sword, but with custom. For days he listened to his advisors. Some said it would be dangerous to press the Lapith king any further. Others argued that remaining silent would mean accepting open humiliation. In the end, Dioneus made his decision. A ruler's duty to protect his right was not an act born of anger, but a necessity that kept order standing. If a son-in-law could loosen the vows he had made at his wedding according to his own convenience, then not only a father, but all custom would be diminished there. That was why he sent his men at first light. Ixion's most prized horses were to be taken as security. This decision was heard across Thessaly in a short time. For in those lands, a horse was not merely an animal. The breed, strength, and number of the horses in a king's stables showed his wealth, his power in war, and his honor. Ixion's horses were especially famous. Their speed, strength, and wildness had made them a point of pride for the Lapith court. What Dioneus did was a more visible reminder than drawing a weapon. "Keep your word," he was saying, "or I will hold to my right in a way everyone can see." When the news reached Ixion, the young king's first reaction was not to shout. He went to the stables. He looked at the empty places one by one. The servants tried not to meet his face. The guards were silent. Ixion's expression first emptied, then hardened like stone. He did not give orders loudly. He did not let his anger spill outward. That was what made him truly dangerous, because when some people grew angry, those around them were warned. But when Ixion grew angry, he became quiet, and his silence was more frightening to everyone in the room than shouting would have been. He did not see the taking of the horses as a loss of property. He saw it as an open act against his own greatness. In his eyes, Dioneus was no longer merely an old king seeking his right. He was a man trying to stop him in front of everyone. The most dangerous tendency in Ixion's character showed itself once again here. He heard a rightful boundary, as if it were a personal attack. When Dia saw the silence that appeared on her husband's face that evening, a cold fear settled inside her. This was not passing anger. This was the inward state of a mind drawing back before making a decision. Ixion moved through the palace, but he hardly spoke at all. The servants behaved more cautiously wherever he passed. The advisors did not speak unless they were asked. The rhythm of the house had changed. Sometimes disaster was first heard exactly there. The walls remained in place, people did their duties. Life looked the same from the outside, but the tension in the air told of something else being built. Dioneus still believed that what he had done could create a return. His purpose in having the horses taken was not hostility, but reminder. He did not want to force Ixion into humiliation. He wanted to compel him to think again about the weight of the promise he had given. He did not want to throw his daughter's marriage entirely into the fire, and he hoped that reason might prevail at the last moment. But Ixion decided to turn that hope into something else. After remaining silent for several days, he suddenly acted as though he had changed his attitude. He sent his most trusted messengers to Dioneus. In his message, he said that the recent events had made him reflect, that the tension between them had become wearing for both houses, and that he now wished to mend the break between them. He said he had understood once more the weight of his words, that the promised gifts would be delivered, and that the two households should be remembered not with hostility, but with honor. But Ixion did not stop there. He wanted to strengthen his apology not only with words but with display. He announced that he would hold a great feast at his palace in Larissa. This feast would be a sign of reconciliation. Dioneus would be received there. A language of peace would be spoken before everyone, and the tension between them would be closed. When the news spread through Thessaly, many were surprised. Ixion's pride was well known. Such an open step back seemed out of character for him. That was exactly why it seemed convincing. People were inclined to think that a proud man would behave like that only if he had truly been forced. When Dioneus received the news, he remained silent for a long time. His advisors split into two sides again. Some said the change was too smooth, that the young king's pride would not melt so easily. Others thought that refusing this invitation would break a bond already cracked beyond repair. Dioneus listened to all of them. In the end, he made his decision not in anger, but once again from a sense of responsibility. Dia's life stood before him. The honor of both houses stood before him. If the young man truly meant to turn back, closing that door could become a greater wound. The invitation was accepted. Preparations began at once in Larissa. The courtyards were cleaned, the torches were renewed, wine was brought up from the cellars, and long tables were set. To anyone looking from the outside, everything announced a great night of reconciliation. But these preparations had an unseen side, as well as a visible one. For Ixion, peace was no longer the goal. Peace had turned into the flawless covering for a darker intention. As Dioneus set out for Larissa, he carried with him not only the caution that age had given him, but also one last fragment of hope. Ixion, however, had already made another decision, and that decision was of the kind words could never repair. From a distance that evening, the palace in Larissa looked like the final shape of a long-awaited peace at last made real. The torches in the courtyard had been lit one after another, the doors had been polished, and the surfaces of the stone walls had taken on a softer look in the light. Inside, the great hall had been prepared. Long tables had been set, goblets had been arranged, and wine jars had been brought out from the cold rooms. Servants moved without pause, and the musicians quietly rehearsed in their own corners. There had been no flaw in the order of that evening. Every detail had seemed prepared to tell the arriving guest one single thing. There was not hostility here, but repair. When Dioneus arrived at the palace, he noticed that care. The suspicion he had carried all along the road still remained in place, but the sight that greeted him at the gates of Larissa began to wear it down. Ixion stood at the entrance in person. He wore clothing worthy of a king, elegant but not excessive. On his face there appeared neither an expression of exaggerated remorse nor the open hardness of his old pride. He kept his voice low. When he extended his hand, he did so not like a man issuing a challenge, but like someone ready to mend a broken bond between equals. "Thank you for coming," he said. Dioneus studied his face carefully. He thought he knew this man by now, and yet some people's true face shifted again at the very moment you thought you had seen it. The old king tried to detect in his son-in-law's eyes the shadow he had noticed in those first days. But there at the door, in the torchlight and before everyone's eyes, Ixion looked flawless. Dioneus only nodded without saying a word. They went inside together. Dia was there that evening as well. When she saw her father, her chest tightened. It was not that she had not wanted him to come, but the feeling that had been gnawing at her since his arrival could not truly be called hope. To an outside eye, the fact that her father and her husband were coming together again in the same hall, beneath the same light and around the same table, might have looked like a good sign. But Dia could not forget the quiet hardness that had settled into Ixion's face in recent weeks. The young king's softened appearance brought her no relief. On the contrary, it sharpened her vigilance even more. Because when some people truly stepped back, something in them lightened. Ixion, however, looked more composed, calmer, and more controlled. That gave Dia not peace but unease. When the feast began, everything flowed so naturally that many people in the hall soon forgot the tension. The music rose, goblets were filled, the first dishes were brought to the tables. Ixion stopped often at Dionysus' side, personally signaling that the finest wine should be served to him and instructing the servants to be careful. His words were measured. He was neither overly warm nor distant. That was the most dangerous thing he did that evening. He played his role flawlessly. At one point he spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, but without shouting. "Sometimes pride opened a man's eyes too late," he said, "but even eyes that opened late still saw." A brief silence fell over the hall. Some heard those words as a genuine confession. Others took them only as an elegant remark. Dionysus, however, looked between those words with the suspicion moving inside him. Even so, a sentence spoken like that in public loosened the hardness within a person, if only slightly. Especially if you were someone like the old king, someone who still wanted to believe in the possibility of one final correction. Later, Ixion sat beside him. For a while, in full view of everyone, he spoke of ordinary things: the weather, the harvest, the latest news from Thessaly, the horses of the Lapiths, the movement in neighboring regions. Then his voice lowered slightly. "I would like to speak today," he said, "about the things I delayed with you, but not in the middle of a crowd." That sentence had been delivered exactly as it needed to be. It was not an apology outright, but it sounded like a door leading toward one. Dionysus listened to him. From a distance, Dia looked at her father's face at that moment. For the first time, she saw a clear easing in the old king's expression, and at that exact moment, the fear inside her grew, because her father was softening, and that was exactly what Ixion wanted. In one part of the hall there were fewer torches than elsewhere. The light there was still enough, but the shadows were longer. Even when Dionysus noticed this, he still could not identify what was strange about it. The floor did not look different from the other stone sections. The decorations spread across it, the light coverings that had been placed there, and the play of shadows made everything appear natural. In the middle of a feast, a person did not expect death, especially when the one inviting you forward was your son-in-law, and when he had just spoken the language of reconciliation before everyone, even the sharpest suspicion could not maintain its keenest edge. Ixion rose to his feet. "If you would like now," he said. Dionysus also stood, moving heavily. He was advanced in age, but his walk still remained steady. The two men began to move together through the crowd. The music continued. The servants kept moving. Goblets were emptied and filled again. Life in the hall went on. That was the most horrifying thing about the night. Disaster had been placed seamlessly inside the ordinary flow of things. At that moment, Dia rose from her place. A sudden tightness seized her, one she could not fully explain. She looked in the direction her father and her husband had gone. Something inside her cried out, "Stop!" But a king rising in the middle of a gathering for a private conversation looked entirely ordinary from the outside. Everyone around her behaved that way too. No one sensed danger. Perhaps the deepest evil began exactly there. When it hid itself inside a moment everyone accepted as normal. Ixion walked a few steps ahead. Dioneus followed him. When they reached the place, the young king slowed very slightly. That slowness did not come from hesitation. On the contrary, it carried the certainty of a man choosing the exact moment. Then he stepped slightly aside and turned his head just a little. "Here," he said. Dioneus looked down before him. The stone floor seemed reassuring. The old king took his step. At that moment, the floor gave way. Everything happened so quickly that for the first few breaths the people in the hall could not understand what they had seen. The thin coverings, the light branches, and the surface made to resemble stone suddenly collapsed into the void. Dioneus lost his balance. Before he had even found the chance to reach out with his hand, the darkness dragged him in. Then the sudden light of fire rose from below. One moment there had been the yellow glow of torches. The next, there had been a red, sharp brightness, the kind that made a person's face pull back. The music stopped. Hands holding goblets froze in mid-air. The servants stood still. The guests forgot how to move before anything else, because what stood before their eyes was not a fight, nor was it a murder born of sudden impulse. A king had lured his elderly relative, a guest under his own invitation, into a trap prepared in advance right in the middle of the appearance of peace. Dia's scream was the first thing that tore through that silence. It was such a crushing moment that later even she would not remember whether she ran toward her father or whether she simply stopped before the collapsed floor all at once. But she saw his face, Ixion's face. That was what she never forgot. There was no anger there, no panic, none of the horror of a man who had just realized what he had done. There was only the coldness of a completed decision. That look carved a line inside Dia that would never close again. The guests slowly began to draw back. Some stood up, some turned their heads away, and some walked backward without saying a word. Because remaining in the hall felt like sharing in what had happened. The servants lowered their eyes to the ground. Even the guards seemed frozen, unable to tell who would give the order. Everyone understood the same thing. This had not been a moment of sudden rage. This night had been planned. Every torch, every word, every goblet, every smile had served this end. Ixion did not step back, nor did he try to deny what he had done. He looked as though he had simply removed an obstacle that needed to be removed. But there was one thing he could not see in that moment. By sending Dioneus into the fire, he had pushed not only the old king but also his own legitimacy into that pit. He might still sit on his throne, give orders, and keep the guards at his side. But from that moment on, no gaze would ever see him as it once had. That skillfully concealed, treacherously designed fire pit in Larissa did not swallow only one man. That night, the name of a king changed as well. And in the same night that Dia lost her father, she also lived through the moment when she truly saw who her husband was. Even if she would continue to live beside Ixion after that hour, she would no longer be living in the same world as he was. On the morning after that night in Larissa, the sun rose behind the mountains in the same way it always had. The stone walls of the palace still stood in place. Guards still kept watch in the courtyard. Servants still carried water in vessels, and the doors still opened and closed. From the outside, the order of things seemed unbroken. But when Ixion woke, he felt more clearly than ever, for the first time, that what truly held the world upright was not stone or crown, but the invisible acceptance of other people. What he had mistaken for victory the night before took on another meaning in the cold light of morning. The palace was still his, but the air inside it no longer belonged to him. He noticed it at once when he walked through the corridors. The servants who once stepped aside to clear his path still moved out of the way, but they lowered their eyes. The guards still saluted, but they did not look at his face. No one spoke loudly, yet no one behaved as naturally in his presence as they once had. Fear was a familiar thing for a king. People recoiled from power, guarded themselves against anger, and shrank from punishment. But what Ixion felt that morning was not fear. Something else had filled the air inside the palace. Disgust. Silent, heavy, and irreversible disgust. A person could endure being feared, but it was hard to endure being treated like a stain wherever he stood. That morning, Ixion understood for the first time that the looks turned toward him no longer carried only attention, but rejection. Those who had seen what happened during the night did not wait for sunrise before the news spread beyond the palace. From the early hours of the morning, the leading men of the Lapiths began gathering in the courtyard at Larissa. Messengers came from neighboring houses. Dionysus's men were already burning with anger. Everyone said the same thing, yet no one shouted it. Some crimes were so heavy that a person's voice lowered on its own. Ixion had not merely killed an enemy, he had killed his guest. And he had done it at his own table, at his own invitation, in the very center of a scene made to look like reconciliation. A crime like that carried a stain deeper than blood spilled in war, because here, along with death, trust had also died. That morning, Dia sat in the quietest room of the palace. Had she wept all night, or had she remained silent as stone? Even those who saw her could never later describe it with certainty, but the expression on her face had changed. It carried not only the trace of grief for her father, but the mark of something heavier. Her father had not been taken by a stranger's sword. He had been taken by the hand of her own husband. For that reason, her pain did not move in a straight line. Shame had mixed into grief, anger into shame, and into that anger had settled the feeling that nothing could be undone. She sat as though one hand held the weight of the child in her womb, as if for the first time she feared the future. Sometimes a father left land to his child, sometimes a name, sometimes protection, but some fathers left their children nothing but shadow. Dia understood that morning. Ixion did not go to her. Even if he had wanted to, what could he have said? An apology? An explanation? A claim to justification? What had happened the night before had already passed far beyond the point that words could repair. And besides, Ixion's nature did not contain the natural language of true remorse. He still saw what he had done not as a moment of weakness, but as a decision that had achieved its result. Perhaps in the first hours, he felt a slight shock within himself, but that shock did not come from the crime. It came from the fact that the world around him had not behaved as he expected it would. The young king had thought that once he removed an obstacle, the path before him would open. Instead, along with that obstacle, he had destroyed the last legitimate respect anyone still felt for him. Toward noon, the meeting inside the palace began. The elders of the Lapiths, the leading warriors and the counselors came together. It was not arranged like a court. No long speeches were made, and no ceremonial display took place. There was no need. The truth at the center of it all stood too plainly to require many words. The killing of Dioneus was grave enough on its own, but what truly determined the judgment was the manner of the murder. The law of hospitality had been violated. Kinship had been violated. Trust had been violated. And all of it had been done by a king's own hand. In the custom of the ancient world, a stain like that could defile not only the man who committed it, but the house that sheltered him. So the question was no longer, was Ixion guilty? The real question was this: could such a man continue to sit on the throne? No one gave a different answer. When Ixion entered the gathering, he still kept his face hard. He thought that this palace was his own palace, that he was the king of the Lapiths, and that he would not bow because an old man from outside had chosen to remind him of limits before everyone. The anger of a ruler accustomed to solving things through force still lived inside him. But the looks in that room gave him nothing he expected. There was no fear. There was no hesitation. There was not even the smallest sign that anyone still continued to regard him as king. Sometimes a person understood that he had been defeated not in battle, but at the moment when those looking at him no longer saw a title, but a stain. For Ixion, that moment was this one. The decision was not delivered to him at sword point. No one drew a weapon. No one issued a challenge. They simply told him that he could no longer sit on that throne. The words were short and hard. They stated openly that after the night at Larissa, the lands of the Lapiths could no longer regard his presence as legitimate, that no house could open its doors to him until that stain was cleansed, and that anyone who kept him beside them would share the same shadow. This was not only an exile, but also a rejection. The crown was not physically taken from Ixion's head, but the crown lost the meaning that had once allowed him to carry it. At first he grew angry. Then that anger struck a wall because there were no people before him who would panic and retreat. In the end, he was forced to step back. His departure from the palace looked nothing like the grand exits he once made. There was no crowd bowing before him, no loyal company trailing behind him. People still stood along the roads, but this time they moved away because they did not want to see him. Women standing in doorways called their children inside. Old men turned their faces in the other direction, and no one wanted to meet his eyes. Sometimes the fall of a king began not when he lost his army, but when people lowered their voices wherever his name was spoken. Ixion's name changed in exactly that way on that day. He was no longer the proud ruler of the Lapiths, but the man who had sent his own kinsman into the fire at his own table. In the first days of exile, he still searched for a way out. The laws of the ancient world sometimes left a door open, even for the worst offenders. A king, or someone who carried sacred authority, could take such a man under protection and attempt to restore him to society through a rite of purification. Ixion clung to that possibility. He remembered his old ties. He sent word to neighboring houses. He thought of friendships once formed, of favors once given, of military support once provided. He believed that somewhere a door could still be found that would not leave him completely alone. But at the very first place he went, the door was shut in his face. The same happened at the second place. At the third, they did not even let him inside. The moment his name was heard, the decision was already made, because people feared not only the murder, but the manner of the murder. A man who killed someone in war was not judged the same as a man who destroyed someone within the shelter of trust. The first could be an enemy. The second could enter the home. No one wanted to sit at the same table with a stain like that. As the days passed, Ixion's anger gave way to something else. First came humiliation, then exhaustion. Then, when night fell, the images returned. Every fire he saw reminded him of the pit in Larissa. Sudden silences brought back the moment when the music had stopped all at once. Sleep did not restore him, and wakefulness did not free him from thought. His mind began to stop being a place that protected him and turned instead into the first chamber of his punishment. As he wandered alone along the slopes of Pelion, over the harsh roads of Magnesia, and across the windy plains of Thessaly, the ruler's appearance he once carried began to come apart. His hair grew long, his beard became unkempt, his clothes wore down. Those who saw him from a distance did not recognize him at first, and when they came closer, they changed their path. Children feared him, dogs grew uneasy, and no house wanted to let him inside. Sometimes a person collapsed not from hunger, but from the fact that no face remained that waited for him. Ixion was moving toward that place. The fire pit in Larissa swallowed Dioneus, but by the next morning that same pit, in an unseen way, had also pulled the rest of Ixion's life down into itself. At a high and desolate point in Magnesia, Ixion sat beside a fire that was on the verge of dying out, and that night he believed that no door on earth remained open for him anymore. The wind was dry and sharp. The cold gathered over the stones immediately pushed back the fire's weak warmth, and the starless sky stood above like a single unbroken mass of darkness. Days of walking, hunger, sleeplessness, and doors shutting in his face had brought him to such a place that even anger no longer kept him standing. When a person hit the very bottom, he could sometimes still carry a spark inside him. Ixion had passed even that point. Only exhaustion remained. Then the texture of the night changed. At first, he took the faint brightness that appeared in the distance for another fire. Maybe it was a traveler moving along the mountain road, or the late burning hearth of a shepherd. But that light resembled nothing carried by human hands. It did not flicker. The wind did not break it apart. It did not look yellow or smoky like the flames that belonged to the earth. It came growing through the cold air, yet as it grew, it did not merely light the darkness. It seemed to bring another meaning to the place where it stood. Ixion lifted his head. For the first time in a long while, he could not move, not from fear, but from astonishment. As the light drew nearer, something else drew near with it. Weight. This was not the weight of armed men or kings passing judgment. It was an order without a voice, yet one that would not allow its presence to be denied. Every form of power he had seen on earth either threatened or displayed itself. Here there was neither threat nor display. There was only a shattering certainty. Ixion felt that for the first time he stood before a gaze that saw him completely before judging him. In that moment he no longer had the strength to cling to his own lies. Then the ascent began. It did not resemble walking, climbing, or falling. It was as if the weight of the earth was being drawn out of his body. The stone beneath his feet, the dim fire, the dry ground of Magnesia slowly remained below. At first, Ixion seemed to want to resist, because no matter how ruined a person became, he recoiled when he was torn away from the ground he knew. but he had neither the strength to resist nor the clarity to know what he was resisting. He only watched. Thessaly was shrinking below him. Valleys, mountain ridges, roads, palaces, and his own corrupted past began to look farther away and more faded. The roads of the sky did not resemble the roads of the earth. Their distance changed not only length but meaning. As Ixion rose, he felt this. The world he had left below looked smaller with all its harshness and crowding. The place opening before him was not only higher but clearer, heavier and more ordered. It was as if everything there stood in the form of which people on earth carried only a shadow. Even time moved differently. There was no hurry. There was no compression. Everything was exactly where it belonged and exactly what it was. That was how the nearness of Olympus felt to him. When he was taken into the great halls, the first thing Ixion saw was not splendor but order. The palaces of earth could also shine and dazzle the eye with bronze, stone, and gold. But in all of them, there was some trace of human ambition. On Olympus, magnificence seemed not to have been arranged in order to be displayed. It was there simply because it had to be there. The columns rose, yet they gave no burden. The floor shone, yet its richness did not cry out. Everything was in its proper place. No detail felt excessive, and no part overwhelmed another. Ixion, a man who had grown used to standing above everyone in Thessaly, felt for the first time that he had truly become small here. And yet there was no humiliation in that smallness. Zeus did not treat him like a prisoner. He had not brought him out of exile and up here merely to judge him. It was not that he failed to see his crime. On the contrary, he acted while seeing everything. And yet he did not turn his face away from him. Quietly but plainly, he made room for him. This was the kind of mercy no king on earth had ever taken upon himself. At first, Ixion struggled to make sense of it. In the order of men, doors closed to one who had committed a grave crime. Here the will that stood above all doors was opening one to him. The silence on Olympus soon showed that this acceptance had surprised everyone. The gods did not draw near to him, but neither did they deny his presence. Some looks held curiosity, others distance. No one acted warmly, but no one spoke a single word against Zeus's decision either. In the middle of this, Ixion suddenly felt all his weariness more heavily. For a person who had long been cast out, being accepted again could sometimes shake him more deeply than punishment. When the cleansing began, that shock deepened. The filth on his hands was washed away. The dust of the road on his face was cleaned. The worn ruin upon him was removed. But the truly important thing was not the cleansing of his body. What shook him most was being treated as if he were someone again. For a man who had been turned away from doors for years, avoided by glances and regarded as accursed, this was almost unbearable. When nectar was set before him, his hand hesitated. Once he had been used to great tables, but exile stripped not only a person's body, but also his habits. When he reached for the cup, not only taste, but also a buried fragility loosened in his throat. And in that moment he truly felt gratitude. It was not false. At least it was not false in that first moment. When he looked at Zeus, he saw before him not only a powerful god, but a second door of the kind no human being had ever shown him. If he had stopped there, perhaps the story might have flowed in another direction. Because sometimes a person's salvation was hidden not in great words, but in that brief moment when he accepted his own smallness. Ixion lived through that moment, but he could not carry it. In the first days he remained quiet. He walked through the great halls with heavy steps, looked around like a stranger, and took care not to step beyond the limits of the place set aside for him. At first, Olympus was a dizzying place for him. Every column, every look, every silence seemed to carry a meaning. Zeus left him within that silence. He neither kept laying his past before him, nor carried his forgiveness like a reproach over his head. Sometimes the heaviest mercy was leaving a person alone with his own inner voice. But time turned astonishment into habit. As the days passed, the order of Olympus began to lose its first shattering force. Everything that had first made him feel small gradually began to seem ordinary. The taste of nectar, the perfection of service, the magnificence of the halls, the open acceptance of Zeus. The human mind always found a way after a while to fold even the greatest privilege into the atmosphere of its own daily life. The corruption inside Ixion began exactly there, for he was not a soul who knew how to carry what he was given with gratitude. If he was accepted in a place for long enough, he was inclined to stop seeing that acceptance as grace and begin seeing it as the natural return for his own worth. Inside the door that Zeus's mercy had opened, the seed of the second disaster had already been planted. In Ixion's first days on Olympus, his silence did not draw attention. That was how it was expected to be. For a man whose name had begun to be spoken with misfortune after every door on earth had been closed in his face, being admitted into the highest order of the heavens was deeply unsettling in itself. So the fact that he walked with heavy steps through the great halls did not speak unnecessarily, and avoided crossing beyond the boundaries of the place set aside for him seemed natural, and that was what he did. For a long time he only watched. He watched the open spaces between the columns, the distance the gods kept between one another, the silent balance that rose before a word was spoken. On Olympus, everything had a measure. How close one could come where one fell silent, at what moment one appeared, all of it was bound to an almost invisible law. At first, that order made him feel small. In Thessaly, he had been the one who measured everyone and placed each person according to his own judgment. Here he felt that he was the one being measured. The feeling was not humiliating so much as it was unsettling. For the first time, he found himself in a place where his own will was not the center. Zeus's mercy made that feeling even heavier. He had not been left outside. Zeus had not thrown his crime in his face and turned him away. On the contrary, he had let him in. In those first days, Ixion truly felt crushed beneath that greatness. When nectar was offered to him, he still felt gratitude. Like someone who had forgotten what it meant to be treated as human again, he carried each small act of acceptance quietly within himself. But that state did not last long. A person's power to adapt was one of his greatest strengths, but it was also one of his greatest weaknesses. In those first days, the light of Olympus had been dazzling. Then it had begun to seem natural. The service had been flawless. Then it had started to feel like something to be expected. The splendor of the great halls, the grave balance among the gods, Zeus's open acceptance. As time passed, all of it ceased to be a gift in Ixion's mind and became part of the normal order around him. That was exactly where the fracture took place, because Ixion was not someone who protected what he had been given with gratitude. He was someone inclined to claim as his right whatever he became accustomed to. At first, only the way he walked changed. His shoulders began to settle farther back. His silence stopped carrying careful attention and began to carry ease. Then his gaze changed. The things he had first looked at with admiration, he now looked at by comparison. He began to notice the distance the gods kept while speaking to one another, how easily certain figures entered certain halls, which ones remained near Zeus longer than others. He no longer watched these things with the curiosity of a stranger. He watched them with the alertness of a mind, measuring how much room had been made for him here, and how far he might go. One evening he felt it more clearly. A feast had been laid out in the great hall. Music rose slowly and the goblets shone. As the gods spoke, a kind of calm spread through the hall that did not exist in the human world. Everyone remained in their own place. No one overflowed into another's space, yet the weight of each presence could be clearly felt. Ixion watched this for a while. Then his attention took on a direction that seemed involuntary, but slowly began to linger longer. His gaze rested on Hera. It was not the first time he had seen her, of course, but it was the first time he had not been content merely to see her. Hera's presence drew a different line through the hall. It was not the effect created by ordinary beauty. What stood around her was less a sense of beauty than a sense of order. The dignity she carried beside Zeus was not simply the weight of a wife or a queen. She seemed like a part of the boundaries of Olympus itself. Her unreachability did not come from physical distance, but from the fact that she was someone one should not naturally approach. For an ordinary mortal, that line would have taught retreat before desire. In Ixion, the opposite happened. That line made him hold his gaze there longer. Within himself, he did not immediately call it a crime. At first, he read it as ordinary admiration. Then he began to think of it as a natural extension of the freedom opened to him by his being on Olympus. When a person decided to deceive himself, he first changed the words. He did not call it forbidden, he called it the possibility of closeness. He did not call it a boundary, he called it distance. He did not call it insolence, he called it courage. Ixion's mind began to work in exactly that way. The thing that should have stopped him began to look less and less like a threat and more like ground that simply had not yet been reached. Hera had not failed to notice it. On Olympus, no gaze remained completely hidden. It could be felt when a face turned toward someone, how long it stayed there, and what thought it left behind when it withdrew. When Hera sensed the change in Ixion's gaze, she made no effort to bring it into the open. Changes of that kind usually revealed themselves more clearly in a short time. Still, from that moment on, an invisible distance in her response to Ixion grew firmer. She looked at him more briefly. She gave him fewer words. Though he remained in the hall, he no longer began to be fully taken into it. Ixion did not read that cooling as a warning. On the contrary, he misread it. A person sometimes mistook the distance before him not for rejection but for the effect of his own power, especially when a sense of entitlement had begun to grow inside him. Ixion's delusion deepened there. He began to read the withdrawal of others as the weight of his own presence. He took the fact that fewer words were given to him as a sign that he was being watched with care. This was his oldest flaw. When he saw a boundary, instead of drawing back, he became curious about how strong that boundary really was. Zeus watched all of this in silence. For the ruler of the heavens, the change growing inside Ixion was not hidden. When he had brought him to Olympus, he had seen not only his crime, but his character as well. That was why his mercy had not been a blind pardon. It had also been one final chance. Some people grew smaller beneath a second chance, while others began to read that second chance as proof of their own greatness. Ixion had been slipping into the second path. Zeus saw it, but he did not intervene at once. A person's true face often revealed itself not when a prohibition was laid down, but when he was expected to stop even without one. At the end of one day, as the great hall slowly emptied, Ixion remained standing alone for a longer time. He looked into the open darkness between the columns. He felt the gaze he had just cast, the movement that gaze had left inside him, and the new boldness rising there. One more line had fallen farther behind within him. He no longer felt only like a pardoned exile. He had begun to see his presence on Olympus as the beginning of a further right that had been opened to him there. That was the real danger. In Larissa, disaster had begun not with open rage, but first with a quiet sense of justification built inside. Now the same thing was happening in the sky. No crime had yet been committed. No hand had yet been stretched out. But the most important door inside Ixion had already opened. He had begun to count himself as belonging in a place where he did not belong. And for a person, some falls began not when the first step was taken, but when he first believed he could take it. Every footstep echoing through the marble corridors of Olympus gave a little more courage to that silent thought growing inside Ixion. In the calmer hours of the night, the murmur of the great halls faded, the music drifted away, and only a heavy light remained between the columns. At such times, a person's true inclination could be heard more clearly. When the crowd scattered and the display disappeared, only intention remained. It was in that very silence that Ixion understood. His gaze was no longer merely a gaze, and that the movement within him had begun to take the shape of a decision. At first, one last voice still tried to stop him. It was the mercy of Zeus who had lifted him from the depths of the earth and carried him to Olympus. The night in Larissa, the doors closing, that final moment in Magnesia when he sat there exhausted. But once a person began to see his desire as justified, he heard all the warnings of the past less and less. That was what happened to Ixion as well. Instead of carrying Zeus's kindness as a grace, he began to think there was a hidden space within that acceptance where he could go even further. The things that should have pulled him back no longer seemed like barriers, but like steps he had already climbed. His gaze turning toward Hera was no longer accidental. When she appeared in the hall, his eyes searched for her, and when she was absent, his mind rebuilt her within itself. This had long since ceased to be ordinary admiration, because admiration sometimes made a person smaller. A person looked, then withdrew. With Ixion, the opposite happened. The very fact that she was unreachable gave rise to a new arrogance within him. What truly drew him was not only Hera's beauty. To be able to look toward the highest, most untouchable boundary in Zeus's house, and then begin to narrow that boundary by his own will, awakened the old sickness in his soul once again. He no longer wanted only to see. He had begun to think she could be approached. Hera quietly noticed this change. In Olympus, even the direction of a gaze carried meaning. It could be felt who looked too long, and which silence was carried with what intent. Hera did not ignore the growing excess in Ixion's eyes, but she did not turn it into an open confrontation. Because sometimes it was not enough to crush an intention, it had to reveal itself in its own form. Still, that silence did not come from fear. It came from the calm of one who knew the order had been disturbed and understood how that disturbance would be answered. In the end, she told Zeus what had happened. Zeus was not surprised. The change growing within Ixion had not escaped his notice. But the weight of divine judgment lay not only in punishment, but in making the truth fully visible. If Zeus had turned his anger into lightning at that moment, there would have been only a mortal carrying a forbidden thought. But a heavier lesson was needed here. The flaw inside Ixion was not desire alone. It was a corruption of the soul that mistook mercy for entitlement, belittled limits, and began to read the goodness of a host as a comfort that could be used against him. That was why Zeus decided not to strike at once, but to set a test that would allow Ixion to complete, with his own hand, the inclination already growing in his heart. In the silence of Olympus, mist, light, and emptiness began to arrange themselves into a new order. At first it appeared only as a faint brightness. Then the mist took on a shape the human eye could easily complete. After that, the shape became distinct enough from a distance to resemble Hera's dignity, her bearing, and her unreachable radiance. That was how Nephele came into being. She was neither a real goddess nor an ordinary shadow. She was more like the perfect falsehood a person would cling to once he trusted too much in his own desire. From the outside, she seemed almost flawless, but at her core she contained only emptiness. She had no heart. She had no will. She had no judgment. She had only a surface convincing enough to give back to the person before her whatever he wanted to see. That was why Nephele was not only a trap. She was the final mirror Zeus held before Ixion, but this mirror would not show outward appearance. It would reveal the flaw growing within. Because the true issue was not whom Ixion really saw, but with what desire he approached what he believed he saw. What exposed a person was sometimes not the reality before him, but the way he completed that reality within himself. The order Zeus had established was exactly that, a clear space that would show whether Ixion would stop one last time and question the truth. One night, when the movement in the great halls had almost completely died down, Ixion followed his own thoughts and walked toward the quieter sections of Olympus. This walk was not hurried. It carried no instinctive attack. On the contrary, it carried the dangerous calm of a man who believed himself justified. That was what made it so grave. Sometimes a person completed his crime not in anger, but in inner ease. Ixion moved forward in just that way. He had become so corrupted that he interpreted the door Zeus had opened to him as a sign that he could go further. When he reached the threshold of the sacred chamber, the figure standing before him removed his last doubt. Light filtered through the mist. The outline softened just enough to remain indistinct, and the image was left incomplete enough for a person to finish it with his own desire. That very uncertainty should have been the point where he stopped. But Ixion did not stop, because what truly deceived him was not the order Zeus had established, but the desire within him that had already completed itself. When a person wanted to see something badly enough, he gave up testing the truth. That was exactly what Ixion did. When he approached Nephele, he did not read the silence before him as a warning. He took it as acceptance. He treated uncertainty as secret closeness. He interpreted coldness as the shy nobility of what could not be reached. In that way, he deceived himself and completed his own disaster. Because the true sin here was not that an image turned out not to be real. The true sin was that, in a space protected by Zeus's mercy, he reached with his own desire toward the most sacred boundary in Zeus's house. Ixion's intention was real. His desire to cross the boundary was real. His choosing to see as near something that did not belong to him, simply because he wanted it, was the same as it had always been. Whatever the essence of what he had done in Larissa had been, it was that here as well. Only the stage had changed. At first he thought his desire had been confirmed. For him, this was not only closeness, but a kind of conquest. When a person surrendered to his own delusion, he could mistake even the emptiness in his hands for victory. Ixion lived through that for a brief moment, but no illusion remained perfect forever. As the intoxication began to fade, the emptiness inside the form began to reveal itself. Where he thought there was flesh, a cool dampness remained. Where he thought there was an answer, he felt a deep silence. For a moment, the shape still remained in place, but it had begun to withdraw its meaning. At first, he did not want to see it, because when a person sensed he had gone too far, he often denied the signs before him instead of turning back. Ixion did that for a few moments as well, but the crack had opened, and the cold seeping through that crack announced that the truth was drawing near. Zeus's mercy ended exactly there. He had given a second chance that no king on earth had ever given. He had lifted him from the lowest place of exile and carried him to the highest order of the heavens, and had left before him a door opened in silence. Ixion, in return, had reached with the hand of his own desire into his host's sacred space. Now only the clear form of judgment remained. Even the light of Olympus began to change. The radiance that had seemed soft only moments before now carried a harder, colder, sharper meaning. When the first light of morning struck the marble surfaces of Olympus, Ixion, who had wandered all night through mist, desire, and his own dark thoughts, lived that moment of waking not as a collapse, but as the morning of a rise. In that high place of the sky, morning did not resemble the mornings of the earth. In Thessaly, day opened with the smell of soil, the sounds from the stables, and the slow multiplication of human voices. On Olympus, light rose like a clarity that made everything visible at once. When he thought again about what had happened during the night, the first feeling that settled inside him was not fear, it was pride. He took Nephele's silence as acceptance. He interpreted her uncertainty as closeness, and her coldness as the shy withdrawal of something unreachable. Now that morning had come, even though he held no real proof in his hands, he carried it in his inner world like a completed victory. In the heaviest of his delusions, a person most often surrendered not by thinking he had committed a crime, but by believing he had finally received what he had thought he deserved for so long. Ixion settled into exactly that feeling. To him, the night was not merely a moment of drawing near to a hidden desire, but proof that even the divine order had, in the end, made room for him. His walk through the corridors had changed. A few days earlier, he had moved through those same places more carefully, but now another weight lived in his steps. He stood straighter, looked longer, and kept more silent. But this silence was no longer the silence of a stranger. It was a silence born of inner ease. even of feeling himself to be in a place beyond others. And that was exactly what made him most dangerous. Coarse arrogance revealed itself at once. But the arrogance that formed within, kept itself measured and carried itself like a natural right, was noticed much later. Ixion had begun to walk through Olympus in exactly that way. When he entered the great hall, the silence around him did not feel like a warning. He interpreted it as the echo of his own effect. Yet the gazes of the gods had changed. The distance that had watched him before had now become colder and more distinct. Even so, Ixion did not sense it. When a person bound himself deeply enough to his own delusion, he read on other people's faces not the truth, but only his own story. He did the same. He saw the withdrawn looks as an invisible honor granted to his strength. He attributed the fading closeness to fear or jealousy. The false narrative inside him had begun to turn every sign outside him to his own advantage. That carried him even farther. Arrogance did not only want to possess, it also wanted to declare that it possessed, because a sense of victory carried within seemed incomplete unless it found an echo on the faces of others. That exact urge grew inside Ixion as well. Silence no longer satisfied him. He kept turning the meaning of the night over in his mind, building it into a sign of his own superiority, and in the end, he felt the need to imply it. And so the second step of the disaster began. Something heavier than committing the crime itself, carrying it like greatness. After a while, he began to speak among the crowd, in a tone that could be heard but not openly challenged. At first, his words were indirect. He spoke in sentences suggesting that some distances in Zeus's house might not have been as absolute as they appeared from the outside, that some things thought to be unreachable might not have been so impossible to cross, and that things that seemed unattainable sometimes opened in entirely different ways. His words were careful. They were not a direct confession, but everyone who heard them could feel that the sentences carried not only thought, but implication. At first, surprise appeared on the faces of those listening to him, because such insolence was not the kind the human mind easily expected. Ixion did not stop there. As the implication grew, so did the confidence in his voice. If he could have withdrawn in that moment, perhaps some hesitation might have risen within him. But the opposite happened. He interpreted the silence in the hall in his own favor. He took the fact that no one openly opposed him as a sign of fear or unwilling acceptance, yet that silence was the final coldness before judgment. A person sometimes made his greatest mistake at the very moment when the world before him fell silent, because he mistook that silence for approval. Ixion also read the gods' withdrawn gazes as a silent reaction to the magnitude of his own boldness. And so his words became more explicit. He did not openly say that he had been close to Zeus's wife, but he went far enough that those listening could form that meaning clearly in their minds. Every sentence that left his mouth dragged him deeper down, because the crime was no longer being carried only within, it was becoming visible. A person was sometimes condemned not because of what he had done, but because he counted what he had done as a victory. Someone who committed a crime could be shaken, could fall silent, could retreat into himself. But someone who carried his crime like proof of his own greatness killed the last inner voice that might have saved him. That was exactly what happened to Ixion. The looks on Olympus now openly hardened. Before, the change within him had been observed in silence. Now it was felt that the waiting had come to an end. Disgust showed on some faces, on others a cold certainty, because this was no longer only a forbidden desire, it was an insolent ingratitude committed against mercy. A mortal who had been welcomed at Zeus's table, purified by Zeus's will, and given a place within the order of heaven, had now turned toward the holiest boundary of his host and tried to carry it like an achievement. No heavier form of betrayal in hospitality could have been imagined. In Larissa, he had used trust to set death in motion. Now in heaven, he repeated that same essence in another scene. He used the goodness open to him against the owner of that goodness. When Zeus heard these words, he remained silent, but his silence was not the absence of anger. It was the way he gathered the weight of judgment, because everything had now been completed. Since the moment Nephele had been created, the order that had been set in place had waited for Ixion to reveal the darkness within himself by his own hand. And now that darkness stood too openly to be denied. Ixion had not merely been deceived. He had counted his deception as conquest. He had not merely wanted to cross a boundary. He had believed he had crossed it and boasted of it. He had not merely shown ingratitude. He had carried his ingratitude like proof of his own superiority. The true weight of divine justice took shape there. The air of Olympus changed. The corridors were the same, the columns were the same, and the morning light still struck the surfaces with the same clarity. But within all that visible order, a harsher, colder pressure moved. It was as if the sky itself was now preparing for something else. Ixion could not feel it, because when a person enlarged his own lie enough, he became unable to read the meaning of the world outside him. He lifted his head a little higher, his voice came out a little more confidently, and at that very moment he lost completely the chance of turning back. In truth, his salvation lay hidden in something very small, in a hesitation, in a single doubt passing through him, in a brief chill that might have appeared as he thought again about the night. But he experienced none of these. Instead, he gripped the delusion he had built even more tightly. Rather than being shaken after the crime, he counted the crime as a sign of his own greatness. That was the point at which a person sank most deeply, because there not only the act, but the soul itself was corrupted. And so that morning was written into the memory of heaven, not as a morning of victory, but as the last stop where illusion appeared at its strongest one final time. On Olympus, Ixion had embraced not a goddess, but a cloud shaped by his own arrogance. But when morning came, he interpreted the emptiness in his hands as a divine conquest. And for that very reason, nothing remained that could stop the approaching judgment. The silence of the sky hardened. The light changed. The wind gathered and found its direction. Very soon Hermes would come, and Ixion would understand for the first time that the path he thought was carrying him upward was in fact a circle closing around him. The light changed among the columns of Olympus. Once the light of mercy that had reached toward him on the night of exile had been soft. Now it held the clarity of a judgment that would not withdraw. There was no shouting here, no threat, no hurried anger. On the contrary, there was something more terrifying, certainty. This certainty no longer carried on any argument with man. It had already understood him, already weighed him, and now stood before him as the result. In that moment, Ixion no longer seemed to be either the king of the Lapiths or a privileged guest once welcomed at Zeus's table. All his titles had been stripped away. and only the naked burden of his own actions remained. Then Hermes came. That arrival did not resemble someone being summoned. There was no gentle invitation, no explanation. In the presence of the divine messenger approaching with his golden staff, the heaviest thing was that he carried no personal feeling at all, no anger, no mercy, no mockery, only duty. And few things were as cold as duty. Because a person could resist someone who shouted at him, he could feel wounded by someone who looked down on him. But before a being who had come only to carry out a sentence, he understood that he was no longer a party to a dispute, but the object of a completed decision. Hermes' arrival made Ixion feel exactly that. Hermes spoke no unnecessary words. There was no explanation in his gaze because there was nothing left to explain. The whole process had been completed. Every intention had been revealed. A few sentences rose and died at once in Ixion's mind. Perhaps he might have wanted to say that he had been deceived. Perhaps he might have tried to claim that Nephele had been a trap. Perhaps he still might have spoken of some misunderstanding. But none of these reached his lips. Because what mattered here was not whether what he had seen had been real, but with what desire he had turned toward it. Ixion sensed that, and that sense took his voice from him. Hermes led him toward the outer reaches of Olympus, toward an uncanny place where wind and fire met. This walk was not merely a change of place. Everything that had stood like a symbol in Ixion's life until now was about to take on its true form here. The fire pit in Larissa, the trap he had set for another on earth, the loneliness of the nights of exile, his inability to bear Zeus's mercy, and the measureless gaze he had lifted toward Hera. All of it was preparing to unite in a single scene. In the heights of Olympus, lightning now and then lit distant surfaces, and the wind kept gathering toward a more definite center. As Ixion walked, he felt his legs growing heavier. That weight came less from his body than from his past. Because when a person truly faced himself, he no longer saw events one by one, but as parts of a whole. Ixion experienced that for the first time as well. He saw along the same line that what he had felt for Dia had not been love, but possession, that he had counted Dioneus's trust not as something entrusted to him, but as a bond that could be stretched, that in Larissa he had turned hospitality into a covering for death, that he had carried Zeus's mercy not with gratitude, but with a sense of entitlement, and that now he had reached for a boundary where he did not belong. Each of these things had happened at different times, but the essence of all of them had been the same. He had assumed that what did not belong to him had somehow been close to him simply because he desired it. That was exactly why the punishment awaiting him was going to be circular. When they reached the place of execution, what stood before him was not an ordinary instrument of punishment. Rising against the hard emptiness of the sky, the great four-spoked wheel did not seem like a tool made only of metal, fire, and divine force. Looked at more closely, it became clear that it had not been built merely to bind a body. In every curve of the circle, there seemed to be the shape of wrongs returned to again and again. Its arms were not merely extensions reaching outward from the center. They seemed like all the individual boundaries Ixion had crossed in his life, gathered upon the same axis. Oaths left unkept, the abuse of trust, betrayal clothed in peace, ingratitude in the face of mercy, and at last a hand extended toward a divine boundary. All of it had now turned into a single geometry. Hermes moved around the wheel with a measured and irreversible precision. What he did was less a mechanical preparation than the turning of a life's inner logic into visible form. Because Ixion's life had not been a straight line. At different times, he had returned to the same wrong. That was why the punishment could not be a single straight blow. The circle of the wheel had not been chosen at random. It had been the truest form of Ixion's soul, the shape of a being that kept turning back into itself, that could never permanently emerge from any lesson, that reproduced the same fault again in different scenes. The bindings placed around the wheel were even more terrifying. They did not look like ordinary straps or chains. They carried a living motion, as if they had been woven from serpents, and when they touched the body, they did not merely tighten, but left a shiver inside a person. It was as though they had not been there only to fasten the arms and torso, but to make visible the chain of crimes that had become impossible to unravel. In every twist of them, there was the sense of a road closed off, and in every tightening there was the feeling of a decision that could not be undone. Heavenly sparks moved across the surface of the circle, and although the fire had not yet fully risen, it was already felt around them like a power waiting in readiness. As Ixion watched all of this, different stages collapsed upon one another inside him. First came denial. This could not be happening. Zeus had once shown him mercy. Then bargaining rose up. Perhaps an explanation could still be made. Perhaps the fact of being deceived might lessen the crime. Then came anger. But even that anger died before it could fully take shape. Because in Hermes' presence there was no opening against which anger could stand. In the end, only a cold understanding remained. What stood before him was not death. Death was sometimes a person's last hope. Here, there was no end. There was continuation, and that was the true horror of the punishment. Every turn would become a sentence beginning again. When the moment of binding came, the wind hardened. Without the smallest hesitation, Hermes placed Ixion at the center of the wheel. In that moment, no covering remained anymore. Not Nephele's deceptive silence, not the false feeling of victory on Olympus, not even his old identity as a king. There were only the bonds wrapped around his body, the firelight striking his face, and the naked truth telling him that he would not escape the center. For the first time, Ixion truly feared the idea of eternity, because what stood before him here was not suffering and at last being released. It was repetition without release. When Hermes' staff rose into the air for the last time, it was not merely the sign of the execution. It was also the declaration of the new form of Ixion's story. From this point on, he would exist not only as a person, but as a turning warning. The silence of Olympus deepened even more at that exact moment. The wind held for an instant. The fire drew back its glow and waited. The universe seemed to stop for the span of a single breath. In that suspended instant, Ixion felt every scene of his past along one axis. Dioneus's trust, Dia's broken gaze, the stone floor in Larissa, the darkness of Magnesia, Zeus's hand lifting him upward, the dissolving mist of Nephele. All of it had now closed around the same center. The wheel had not yet fully begun to turn, but its meaning had already been completed. This was greater than the fall of a king. A soul that had answered goodness with ingratitude, turned the mercy shown to it into a step for its own reckless desire, made a boundary seem smaller for the sake of its own will, and imagined itself above the universal order, was now being bound to the false cycle it had built for itself. When Hermes stepped back, What he left behind was not only punishment, it was also an open warning, because Ixion's story did not end here. On the contrary, it was only now taking its true form. In the next moment, the wind would give the wheel its real force. The fire would complete its sentence, and as Ixion made his first revolution, that ominous sound carved between heaven and earth would be born. Everything was ready now. The man who had once been the proud king of the Lapiths now waited at the highest point of the sky, bound to the embodied shape of his own excess, and with that first turn, what would be carved into the memory of the ancient world would not be only a punishment, but the heaviest lesson ever left to humanity. When the wind gave its first force, the true meaning of the punishment was revealed at once. The wheel did not turn with a violent jolt, but with a heavy and deliberate motion. Because of that, the first moment brought not sudden pain so much as a loss of direction. Ixion felt his body trying to escape. His shoulders, wrists, back and legs were all being forced in different directions at once. But the bonds did not let him move even a finger's width beyond the center. That was where the terror began. When a person fell, he thought about the possibility of saving himself. When he ran, he believed he could change direction. When pain came, he tried to pull his body back. But here, there was no pulling back. There was only turning. A turning with no way out of the center, no ending, closing in on a single axis. The fire did not burn around the wheel like an ordinary flame. It moved like a light that made him visible all over again with every revolution. In that way, the punishment did not only cause pain, it also did not allow him to hide. The heat that struck Ixion's face at the beginning of the first revolution was not only torture but also exposure, because now nothing could be covered anymore. Nephele's mist had scattered. The false pride on Olympus had dissolved. The calculated cold-bloodedness in Larissa had also been left behind. As the wheel turned, every language a person built in order to deceive himself was shattered. What remained was only the naked form of whatever he had done. When the first full revolution was completed, Ixion understood one thing: this was not death. Death could have been an end. It could have brought silence after pain. A person endured even the heaviest blow with the hope that it would eventually end. But there was no end here. There was turning. There was beginning again. There was staying bound to the same center, striking the same truth over and over again. When the first revolution of the wheel ended, he grasped that the real punishment was not fire, but continuity. Because sometimes a person collapsed once and fell. Here, every revolution was a new fall. Every turn brought back the first shock with a new certainty. The wind picked up speed a little more. Now his body was not only turning, but feeling its own weight inside every movement. His back was being pressed against the wheel. His wrists were straining inside the bonds, and with every shift of the axis, his head faced the void for a brief moment. The vast emptiness of Olympus appeared from a different angle with every turn. For one moment, fire filled his vision. For another, the dark void below opened up. For another, the silent flash of lightning appeared in the distance, and then everything tipped over again. This was not only torture, it was the shattering of a person's sense of direction, his perception of time, and the way he held on to himself. During the first few revolutions, Ixion still tried to keep his mind. He wanted to find an explanation within himself, to interpret the exact basis of this punishment in some other way. But the wheel did not allow that, because its heaviest aspect was that it did not separate pain from meaning. Every turn was not only a new torment, but also a new remembering. Dionysus's face appeared, the old king's look in Larissa, then the collapsing ground, then Dia's scream, then the cold night in Magnesia, then the hand Zeus extended, then that false moment when he thought he had touched Nephele. All of those scenes began to look, within the turning of the wheel, not like separate memories, but like pieces of a single flaw. That was the true intelligence of the punishment. Ixion's life had not been a straight line. In different scenes he had returned to the same wrong. He had treated what he did not possess as something close to him simply because he wanted it. He had wanted Dia not with love, but with a sense of ownership. He had treated Dionysus's trust not as something entrusted to him, but as a bond that could be stretched. He had not carried Zeus's mercy with gratitude, but had seen it as the natural return for his own worth. And when he reached toward Hera, he had done the same thing again. That was why the wheel was a wheel. Because his crime had not been a single mistake committed once, but a corruption of character that kept turning back to itself. Now that same structure had taken physical form. Just as his life had been a cycle, so had his punishment been. At one point, Ixion heard his own voice. At first, he thought it was the roar of the wind. Then, through that roar, he recognized the broken sound rising from his own throat. As the wheel turned, words began to rise, forced out from between his teeth, sounding as though they belonged to him, yet in truth no longer his own. At first, they did not come in complete sentences. They were fragmented. They broke apart. But with every turn, they became clearer. Few things were as heavy as a person's voice, breaking away from his own will and becoming the bearer of another judgment. Because there the pain did not remain in the body alone. The self also began to change hands. At that moment, Ixion felt something for the first time. On that wheel, he was no longer only someone being punished, but something being shown. Those who saw him would no longer see a man. They would see a result. They would see a warning. The former king of the Lapiths, the mortal who had been welcomed at Zeus's table, the architect of the trap in Larissa, the arrogant guest on Olympus. All of that was dissolving, leaving behind a single meaning. He was turning into the form of his own crime. What turned upon the wheel was his body, but what was erased as it turned was his name. Sometimes a person lost his name before he lost his life. The name separated from the person and became a sign. That was exactly what happened to Ixion. As the turning quickened, the sense of time broke down. It became impossible to tell where the first revolution ended and where the second began. Fire, wind, and emptiness merged into a single motion, but the meaning did not disappear. On the contrary, it grew harsher with every new revolution, because illusion was no longer possible. Nephele's cloud had been left behind. So had the story of victory. Only this truth remained, a soul that wanted to become greater where goodness had been shown to. It was eventually bound inside its own delusion of greatness. This man, turning in the high emptiness of Olympus between the sound of the wind and the sharp light of the fire, was no longer the hero of his own story. His claim to heroism had ended. The language of defense had ended. Only the naked consequence remained. And this consequence was not one that fell silent like death. It was a living consequence, an enduring one placed on display. That was why the first revolution was not only the beginning of the punishment, but the true climax of the story. The trap in Larissa, the exile, Olympus, Nephele, the false victory of the morning, all of it had been leading to this moment, because all of a person's great wrongs were one day gathered into a single motion. For Ixion, that motion was the wheel, and when the wheel completed its first full turn, nothing remained in its old meaning anymore. What hung suspended in the sky was no longer a king. It was a lesson, condemned to turn forever inside its own excess. After a while, Ixion's fiery exile in the sky was no longer told only as the terrible end that came upon one man. As the wheel turned, not only his body, but his story became visible. That name, once spoken in low voices behind closed doors and in the shadows of palaces in Thessaly, had now become an open judgment suspended between heaven and earth. Because the punishment Zeus had given was not a sudden burst of anger. It was the visible form of a result that had been building for a long time. Dionysus's trust had been trampled, and Zeus's mercy had been defiled. The two great acts of goodness that had stood before Ixion had both broken in the same place, where he should have humbled himself. That was why the wheel was not merely the sum of the crimes he had committed. It was the shape that showed how life would close in when goodness was answered in the wrong way. Anyone who looked up at the sky could have seen two things at once in that fiery turning. On one side stood a man who had once carried a kingdom, grown used to power, and measured everyone according to his own will. On the other side, bound to that body, something else was plainly visible: law. That law was not abstract. It was not a moral lesson built out of words. It had been made visible through fire, wind, and repetition, because some truths were taught not only by being told, but by being turned into form. That was exactly what had happened to Ixion. When a person diminished the goodness shown to him, he did not only destroy relationships in the end, he also condemned himself to a life that closed around him. Dionysus's patience had been the first example of that. At the beginning, the old king had used not the power in his hands, but his restraint. He waited, he warned, he made room. He did not sever the bond at once, but Ixion did not see that patience as greatness. He saw it as a softness he could use. Then Zeus came. He opened a far greater door before him. He gave him a second chance that no person on earth could have given. Yet Ixion did not humble himself before that mercy either. Two acts of goodness in two different places had reached the same end. That was where the true harshness of this chapter lay. Some people did not know how to carry what was given to them. They saw the trust placed in their hands not as trust, but as comfort. And they read forgiveness not as an inner order they could rebuild, but as a freedom that allowed them to go even further. That was why the wheel was not arbitrary. On the contrary, it was the answer most fitting to his character, because Ixion's life had not moved in a straight line from beginning to end. He was not someone who made one great mistake and fell. He had returned to the same floor again and again. He had treated what did not belong to him as something close simply because he wanted it. When he saw a boundary, he had not drawn back. He had assumed it could be crossed. He had treated trust not as something entrusted to him, but as a space he could use. He had carried mercy not as a greatness before which he should have lowered himself, but as proof of his own worth. That pattern had turned through his life again and again, and for that very reason his punishment had also been bound to turning. The circle was the shape of the habit that lay deeper than his crime. In time, this story began to be told to children in Thessaly. Shepherds, while looking up at the sky at night, listened to the same warning from their elders. "Look," they said, "some people did not fall because of power. They fell because they took goodness lightly." Those words returned each time with the same weight, because not everyone could have found an old king like Dioneus, and not everyone could have encountered divine mercy like Zeus's. But everyone, at some point in life, met people who showed them patience, opened a door for them, waited for them, and carried them. That was what made the story universal. It was not only a tale of kings or gods, it was a test of how human beings treated one another. Goodness was often quiet. It did not announce itself. It did not speak its own name every day. It waited. It carried. It did not abandon someone at once. Sometimes a friend did that. Sometimes a father, a mother, a spouse, a teacher, or a ruler did. And because it was quiet, it was easy to grow used to it. It was even easier to forget the weight of what we had grown used to. Ixion's true corruption began there. He grew used to Dionysus's trust. Then he treated it as natural. Then he made it lighter in his mind. He did the same with Zeus's mercy. First he marveled at it, then he settled into it, then he began to carry that acceptance as if it were proof of his own greatness. Great collapses were often born there, when a person no longer saw the goodness done for him as goodness. That was why the wheel in the sky made visible not only the price of crime, but also the value of goodness. The graces given to people were often not bright like a sword. Trust, hospitality, forgiveness, second chances, patience, these were invisible. But what held life upright was often exactly those things. Ixion mistook those invisible bonds for weakness. He thought he could use Dionysus's goodwill. He interpreted Zeus's forgiveness as a threshold that could be crossed. The center of the myth hardened here. Goodness was not weakness. Its silence did not make it small. On the contrary, the person who betrayed it first diminished himself, and then was crushed beneath the greatness of that goodness. That was why Ixion's turning in the sky pointed not only to his own excess, but also to the sacredness of goodness. The words repeated upon the wheel carried that truth as well. Those who did good should have been met with kindness. That sentence became even heavier the moment it came from his mouth, because the one who had been forced to say it was the very one who had failed to do it. Ixion, who had once used his words to direct others, delay them and deceive them, was now being forced to carry in his own voice the law that condemned him. That was the finest and harshest side of the punishment. A person could grow used to bodily pain, but to feel that the words coming from his own mouth no longer belonged to him was an entirely different torment. As the wheel turned, his voice turned with it. It had ceased to be the voice of a king and had become the echo of a lesson. Everyone in Thessaly who heard this story was left with the same conclusion. The true test was not how a person was treated, but how he responded to what was done for him. It mattered what someone did when he was given power, yes, but what he did when he was shown goodness was a deeper test. Because it was easy to be careful in the face of power, everyone stayed alert there. But in the face of goodness, a person's real character came out more clearly. Some people softened, some gave thanks. Others began to see goodness as something small. That was where the myth's deepest warning lay. So Ixion's story did not remain only an old tale saying that a great crime brought forth a great punishment. It said something harder than that. Never belittle the hand that opened a door for you. Do not mistake the person who did not judge you at once for someone weak. Do not use as if it were natural ground the person who forgave you, waited for you, agreed to speak with you once more, and left room for you. Because some of the greatest human downfalls were born not from open evil, but from taking quiet goodness lightly. That was why the wheel turning in the sky did not stop. It carried a lesson greater than one man. In every age it said the same thing again. Some bonds were invisible, but they held life together. The person who betrayed them did not only destroy someone else, he also damaged his own center. And when the center was damaged, no matter how high a person seemed to rise, in the end, he was condemned to turn around himself. That was why in time the name of Ixion was spoken not only with fear, but with warning. His punishment had not consisted of fire alone. It had been the meaning seen through the fire. And that meaning, after passing through the whole story, remained in a single sentence. Those who did good should have been respected. Ixion's story seemed to end when the wheel began to turn in the sky. A king had risen, crossed the boundary, scorned goodness, and in the end had been bound to the shape of his own excess. But the story did not close there completely, because that false union with Nephele did not leave behind only an empty deception. From that night, a dark trace also remained, one that would descend upon the world. As Nephele withdrew toward the wild regions of Thessaly, she brought Centaurus with her. Centaurus did not begin like an ordinary child. Even in his earliest form, he carried more unrest than peace. He grew up on the slopes of Pelion under the watch of the nymphs, but that watchfulness was not enough to extinguish the darkness carried in his origin. As he grew, he began to carry the same flaw that had lived in his father Ixion, now in another body, the flaw of reaching toward a realm where he did not belong simply because he desired it. Then he too violated the boundary, and from him there came a new line that belonged fully to neither world. In that way, Ixion's crime was not punished only in the sky, it also became an inheritance on earth. While the wheel turned above, the shadow of that crime kept walking below. That was why Ixion's story was not only a story of punishment, it was also a story of traces. Sometimes a person paid the price of his own mistake himself. Sometimes that mistake went on living after him. It remained in a house, it remained in a child, it remained in a relationship. It seeped into the language, anger, and loss of trust within a society. A corrupted state of soul did not rot only its owner, it also shaped the world it touched. That was exactly where Centaurus stood in the story. He was not only a mythological oddity, he was the living echo in the world of the disorder that had lived inside Ixion. But what was truly unsettling was how familiar this story still felt today. People no longer lived among the columns of Olympus. They did not sit in the houses of old kings like Dionaeus, nor did they go to feasts in Larissa. But the human soul had not changed very much. It still misread the doors opened to it. It still grew used to kindness too quickly. After a while, it still began to treat the patience, love, trust, and forgiveness shown to it as if they were natural ground. Ixion's greatest crime had not been murder alone, nor had it been only the arrogance that reached toward Hera. All of those had been grave, but beneath all of them had lain a more familiar flaw. He had been unable to bear the weight of the goodness shown to him. Dionaeus had given him trust. Zeus had opened a second door for him. Ixion had met both in the same way. First he had grown used to them, then he had made them lighter. Then he had started to believe they belonged to him. Most of the time, a person ruined something not by stealing it all at once, but by first thinking, it had already been my right. Great disasters also began right there more often than not. They began when someone treated another person's patience as part of his own comfort. When he saw forgiveness not as a grace that should have humbled him, but as a freedom that allowed him to go even further. That was why Nephele still lived today. She endured not only as a form made of cloud, but as the way a person mistook what he wanted to see for what was real. Sometimes in a relationship, sometimes in a success story, sometimes while looking at someone else's life, sometimes in the beautiful lies people built about themselves. When a person began to mistake his own desire for truth, he embraced Nephele. Then that image scattered, and what remained was not so much the loss outside, but the deception within. The wheel was the same. It was not only a divine punishment turning in the sky. It was a person returning to the same mistake in his own life. It was carrying the same wounding language to different faces. It was first treating those who had done him good as natural, and then neglecting them. It was believing he kept moving forward while in truth he kept turning around the same center. One day, a person could stop and look back and realize that his life seemed to have moved on, while his soul had remained bound to the same floor. That was the moment when the myth descended from the sky and settled inside a human being. That was why the strongest sentence left behind by the story still remained the same. Those who did good had to be shown respect. That sentence might have sounded old. It might also have sounded too simple, too plain, too familiar. But the greatest fractures in human life were often born from places exactly that simple. From how people treated those who waited for them. From how quickly they forgot those who gave them a second chance. From how natural they took the labor, love, loyalty, and quiet support that stood beside them. Because sometimes a person lost himself not by committing one great evil, but by gathering small acts of ingratitude. Perhaps that was why Ixion's story had not remained only a warning. It had also become a mirror. It had not merely said, he was wrong. It had asked a harder question. How did you respond to the people who showed you kindness? Did you truly see what carried you? Or because it had always been there, had you begun to carry it as if it were your right? That question was unsettling. But sometimes that very discomfort was what made a person notice the turning of the wheel for the first time. And the moment a person recognized his own wheel, he had taken the first step toward getting off it. Because what truly made a person grow was not having everything. It was being able to carry the weight of what had been given to him. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend in the breath of another hero, love.